Welcome back to Neon Liberalism, our weekly podcast where myself, Samantha Hancox-Lee, and my colleague, Jason Bergman, try to bring a little clarity to this chaotic world we live in by, drawing on the immortal science of liberal political economy. This week, we have on the podcast a special guest, Catherine Alejandra Cross, PhD candidate at the University of Washington Information School, where she studies online culture and has written about it for a number of publications, now including Liberal Currents. In fact, just this week has written a great essay called Bluesky Won't Save Us, going over some of the pathologies of social media and how these emerge out of structural features of our information environment, and giving us the controversial policy that we should just ban social media. So we thought it would be great to have her on the podcast this week and maybe talk about some of these issues. So yeah, Catherine, do you want to maybe give us a rundown on what's up with social media and why won't Blue Sky save us?
Well, hello, Samantha and Jason. It's wonderful to be here. I love neoliberalism, Evangelion. Uh, Samantha was just yelling at me, getting the podcast, Catherine, and so here I am, long last. Thank you so much for having me on. The article really, in some ways, is two articles in one. So I start off by explaining as best I can in lay terms how Blue Sky is built and why, although many people, the vast majority of its users, approach it as they did Twitter, Blue Sky as a company has aspirations to be something very, very different from what Twitter is, not merely culturally, but architecturally. That it seeks to be a protocol, not a platform. That is a series of codes, instructions that can be used by anyone for any purpose to create sort of independent little website style instances of Blue Sky to sort of decentralize this very idea of a platform. And I argue that this is actually deeply in tension with what a majority of users want out of Blue Sky as a platform in terms of content moderation, which leads me then to the second part of the article, which talks at great length about why social media writ large is particularly problematic and even, I would say, dangerous from a public health standpoint. That people want Blue Sky to be something that it cannot be, that the company in charge of it does not want it to be, that it may never be, and that this is representative of a larger problem where the most optimistic and perhaps hopeful people with social media and also those most addicted to it are going to have their hopes dashed again and again and again. That the problem is not necessarily just in how social media is built, but in ourselves. That we simply cannot at scale be mass social, a mass society of social media users without some significant percentage of the population getting their brains microwaved. And I, in particular, focus on the people that I call the epistemic elite after a term used in my book, which I should have mentioned in the intro.
Yeah, you should plug it.
I published this past year a book entitled Log Off: Why Posting and Politics Almost Never Mix, out now from your favorite retailers by Little Puss Press. And in that book, I talk about the epistemic elite. That is basically the people that made Twitter a desirable place to be. So that celebrities, politicians, writers, journalists, artists, athletes, actors, people with online stores and marketplaces, people who were popular streamers and things like that. People who are, in other words, influential to one degree or another. When their brains get microwaved on social media, the consequences are very, very dire indeed. I point in the article to the fact that the currently impeached president of the Republic of Korea was one such person, right? That he was, a sort of traditional mainstream conservative in South Korean politics, not great, but then he discovered YouTube and a lot of the extreme right-wing nationalist Korean language YouTube, entering a horrid feedback loop with them, and even nominating some of those people into the government, a pattern that we're seeing repeating itself here in the US, what Samantha has memorably called guerrilla channel governance, right? This sort of emulation of the worst aspects of online culture, embedding it more deeply in highly consequential precincts of the physical world. So my article was really about joining together both of these things, that Blue Sky's architecture is perhaps deceptive from the perspective of the average user, that they want Blue Sky to be much more aggressive with content moderation, but Blue Sky is hesitant to do that because that's at odds with their decentralizing protocol-based ethos. And that this illustrates a larger point about how not just Blue Sky, really, but social media writ large, especially the microblogging model, is not the secret sauce that I think a lot of us have been hoping for, the sort of shortcut for politics.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd say a little bit. I mean, obviously there's so number one, there's a lot to chew on here, and we're going to try to come back to all of it. But definitely I'm interested in this phrase you used, a protocol, not a platform, which is somewhat technical as I understand it. So I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about like what this is on a technical coding level and like why people think this kind of code is going to save us, basically.
Well, certainly. I think that to try and explain it as simply as possible, you can think of what Blue Sky Corporate aspires to as creating something similar to the protocol that underpins, say, websites, right? Like anyone theoretically can have their own website that they are the sole controller of, and then within extraordinarily broad restrictions, can put whatever they like on there and not really have it moderated or censored or otherwise controlled by anyone except them, unless, of course, they live under a regime where the ISPs are compelled to, say, block particular websites. But the idea with Blue Sky is that the bsky.social platform that people, the vast majority of Blue Sky's users use, the 25 million users that have been so proudly touted recently, is more like a product demo for what Blue Sky is actually trying to sell, which is the protocol, to say that you can make your own version of this, your own little Twitter that you control, and it can theoretically talk to all of the other instances of Blue Sky or not. It's a lot like the federated system that Mastodon uses, but much more obscured. So, from the perspective of a new user with Mastodon, you're immediately hit with the fact that you have to register for a specific server, and then when you try to look at content from other servers, you cannot always interact with it seamlessly, and so on and so forth, because there are all of these barriers between them, because the servers are effectively independently owned, independently moderated, and even independently modified. Like you look at different Mastodon servers, they will sometimes have wildly different affordances and user interfaces and so on. The idea is to do something similar with Blue Sky, but for it to be seamless, for there to be almost an illusion of it being sort of this unitary website. So that's, I think, part of what has made it so much more popular than Mastodon as an alternative to Twitter, because it operates like Twitter. It looks like Twitter. The end user experiences it with the ease and the frictionlessness of the primary Twitter platform. But the reason that protocol advocates really uh, are interested in selling this idea is because they believe in decentralization, which is not a bad thing, right? That, as the old saying goes, the internet has become five websites made up of screenshots of the other four, and you kind of want to break that up a bit. The idea also being that CEO Jay Graber of Blue Sky loves to say that Blue Sky is billionaire proof. That she's arguing that what happened with Twitter, with Musk buying it, could never happen to Blue Sky because you, as the end user, own your following, own your network, right? And can sort of take that anywhere across the protocol. If Elon Musk were to buy Blue Sky Corporate, then you could just easily decamp to some other part of the protocol that he does not control, an independent protocol with its own moderation system and so on. And the idea being that it is less amenable to the dangers of monopolies and oligopolies. So that's what the advocates for it want out of it. But when I say that Blue Sky won't save us, I mean from the perspective of the end user that came to Blue Sky thinking, oh, this can be Twitter but good, right? With real moderation, and we will at last have the town square that we were promised. That's just not going to happen. But I saw Jason raising his hand, and I don't want to
No,
monopolize the conversation.
no, you're doing exactly what you should do. We're talking about your article. So there's a quote in your article that I thought kind of captured it for me for whatever reason. It said, users want Blue Sky to act like a platform and set a firm floor on what and whom will be allowed on bsky.social and not merely leave it to the currents of composable moderation and the whims of individuals. So the way Twitter has worked is that it's a huge platform. It's not a protocol. And Twitter, of course, had tons of employees, many of whom working on, as I understand it, moderation and safety. And then Mr. Musk buys the whole thing, infamously lets go a lot of these people. And my understanding is the Blue Sky team is rather small and probably very focused on this idea, like you've been outlining, of developing this protocol. But now suddenly there are, what is it, 25 million users of bsky.social, the platform, right? And so presumably the current situation, at least as I understand it, is that this very small number of actual Blue Sky employees are being tasked with sort of managing this very suddenly very large platform and the user's demands for moderation of the platform. Is that an accurate sense of how things are at the moment?
I would say so, yes, that Blue Sky has had to effectively be cajoled into acting like a platform. And this is important because academically, like in my field, information science, it is increasingly broadly accepted that it is definitional to the very idea of a platform that it moderates, that there is some mechanism, however loose, this is true even of 4chan, right, that there are rules, formal or informal, that govern what is permitted on the platform and what isn't, who's permitted and who isn't. And for a sort of town square, quote unquote, platform like Blue Sky, there will be, from especially users that are flooding in, escaping the growing chaos on Twitter, a demand for rigorous moderation of prejudice in particular. So, far right extremism, any number of isms and phobias should be moderated strictly. And the thing about Blue Sky is that in addition to sort of the protocol idea, one of the moderation concepts that underpins that is the notion that you, as the end user, have a great deal of control over what you see. And that's part of the logic behind feed, for instance, where you have the ability to select from any number of options that you curate yourself or that have been curated for you by any number of individual Blue Sky users to show you some things and hide others from you, but also a larger system of composable moderation. And what that means is that you, the end user, can choose from a whole menu of options with very fine-grained detail, both provided by Blue Sky and some created by users themselves that you can subscribe to hide or outright block or put behind a drop down different types of content that get labeled both by Blue Sky and by individual users or groups to whom you can subscribe. And the logic is that this will create at last an economy of scale because all of these people will come together and decide for themselves democratically, so to speak, what they as individuals want to see and don't want to see, and will have the experience they want, while some people, to take an obvious example, some people want to see explicit content, sexual content on Bluesky, and others really do not. And so these toggles allow both of those groups to be relatively happy. That's the aspiration. The problem is that composable moderation alone does not deal with certain types of bad actors that have long been endemic to these kinds of platforms. Like, this is not a new problem. And Bluesky, as I talk about in the article, has been consumed by scandals about major moderation faux pas. The infamous one from 2023 being that, like, a user was able to create a screen name that had the N-word in it, and somehow this was not filtered out. That problem was fixed, but after a major outcry led by Black and trans users of the platform. Much more recently, however, there was a big brouhaha over the writer and provocateur Jesse Singal being on the platform. And he is first and foremost litigious, and so I'm trying to choose my words and descriptions very carefully here. Widely regarded by people with whom he naturally disagrees that he is a transphobic propagandist who has done a great deal to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt about transgender healthcare, especially for people under the age of 18. And there was a hue and cry from many, particularly trans users, saying that Singal should have just been banned at the jump because he has done a number of things using social media platforms to drive harassment at individual trans users, critics of his, and so on, something I've personally experienced in the past. And Bluesky communicated very poorly about this, dragged its feet, and eventually settled on a policy, if it can be called that, satisfied nobody, that said, essentially, well, we will only moderate for behavior that is committed on our service. We will not judge people by what they have done elsewhere, which is, especially for certain types of persistently bad actors, a very, very toxic policy to have, and one that is easily exploited. And nobody liked that. There were people who criticized it as, not standing up sufficiently for free speech, and others who criticized it as mealy-mouthed and wishy-washy for, basically allowing a bad actor to have free reign. And it illustrated Bluesky, having a very light touch when it came to centralized moderation. Because when you're dealing with somebody that does use a significant platform to sort of marshal harassment and start hate campaigns, composable personalized moderation, where you just like mute or hide individual things that you personally do not want to see, is insufficient for stopping that kind of manipulation, which is a larger structural problem.
Yeah, so I basically agree with a lot of what you said, and I thought I'd offer my own kind of view on the nature of the problem here. You started with this observation that, the modern internet is just 5 different websites talking about each other. And it's worth kind of emphasizing that nobody made the other websites illegal. The weird internet is still out there if you want to go looking for it. People were attracted to the walled gardens of places like Facebook or Twitter, as it used to be, because it offered them something. And a good, example here outside of the social media space is basically the Apple ecosystem, right? That Apple heavily regulates what, for example, like what you can buy or download through the App Store. And, no one's putting a gun to anyone's head and saying you have to buy an iPhone. But people buy the iPhone because they like the moderation. They don't want to have to curate their own software list to determine for themselves what's malware, right? And what's garbage, right? They want to just get on the App Store and look through do a search and be like, okay, this is a legitimate piece of software, and if I download it, it's going to do what it says on the tin. Even though, the internet is still out there. You can download all kinds of stuff from the world Wild West. And so I think your point in the case of Bluesky, right, is that even if you kind of create this technically decentralized protocol, a centralized protocol, a platform offers people something that they want, right? They don't want to have to do the work of moderating every single thing that comes across their feed on some of, the emotional work of being like, oh my God, there's 100 people calling me slurs, and I don't want to have to go through and block every single one of them. Can't the platform just make sure that these people who are, hate spammers are kicked off? People like that functionality. Is that an accurate summary of the dynamics we're looking at here?
Yeah, that's definitely a huge part of it. Like, you're absolutely right that people are attracted to the walled garden for convenience's sake. And also, as I say in my book, we are all Ariel, the Little Mermaid. We want to be where the people are, right? I've written about this in the past. It reminds me of nothing so much as like the dynamics around old MMOs, where World of Warcraft was just a sort of self-perpetuating engine of population growth for many years. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that, yes, it was the most polished of the Western MMOs, but also it's where everybody was. When people tried to decamp to other games that may have had, niche settings and affordances that were more attractive to a specific subset of users, many of them just drifted back to WoW because that's where all their friends were. And that was where you could more easily play with other people that you wanted to play with. Similarly, people are on platforms like Facebook because that's where their friends are, or they want to follow specific family members and things like that. People were reluctant to leave Twitter because they had established networks that they were reaching, that they needed for their work. They were running an online store, perhaps, or selling independently published work, or freelance journalists and things like that. And that's where their audiences were. That's where their customers were. So there's a real sense in which the virality, the potential for virality is the point, right? The term viral to describe something like going wide on the internet is fairly old, but the democratization of virality, the ease with which it could happen, is one of the defining aspects of Web 2.0, right? The internet that was in many ways created by the advent of Facebook, YouTube, and then Twitter and other social media platforms. The ability for one person who got lucky or perhaps seriously unlucky to suddenly be seen by hundreds of thousands of people all at once, or even millions. And if you were, say, running a fundraiser, that's great because then out of that you're going to get the money that you're looking for instance, or you're going to get a lot of customers or a lot of readers, and that's an attractive prospect for a lot of people. So I think that that lottery-like aspect of it is extremely difficult to shake. So there's what you were talking about, the convenience of it, and I think you are right to compare it to like Apple, where a lot of people just kind of glom onto it because of the ease of use and the sort of popularity begets popularity phenomenon, but also the fact that in the case of social media, it becomes addicting because it holds out that narrow hope that you might become internet famous in a way that benefits you, right? That you'll get the adulation of the masses, you'll get money, you'll get customers, you may find love, you may find a new job, get a new gig, things like that. And you sort of keep sort of thwacking the pinata, hoping that good things only will come out of it.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely correct that you can't ignore the role of network effects in driving people towards these large centralized platforms. And the benefits, real or imagined, that they seem to get out of it. But your piece argues, right, not that these things are good, but that these things are there's that memorable phrase, an invisible industrial effluent, not unlike toxic radiation, right? That this is like a technological reality, but that it is bad for us in some important way, and maybe we'd be better off without it. So I wonder if you could talk us through some of those dynamics and how does that work exactly?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I really enjoyed writing that line that you were quoting and the fact that you made it the sort of subhead, like radiation, social media's invisible scientific effluence that leaves us both more knowledgeable and more ignorant of the causes of our own afflictions than ever. And that actually comes very much from Ulrich Beck, a late German sociologist who wrote in Risk Society in the 80s about how the public was reacting to the realities of, say, widespread pollution, but also radiation, right? The risk of nuclear disasters and things like that. And what I mean by this sort of ignorant about the causes of our own affliction, even as we're more knowledgeable about them, is that with these sorts of invisible harms, the public is aware that they exist, unlike your average medieval citizen who thought that, say, the Black Death was caused by miasma or something like that, or was it that it was a divine punishment? We now know that infectious disease is caused by viruses and bacteria and things like that. Most people, despite at the moment the Republican Party's best efforts, believe in the germ theory of disease. But it doesn't change the fear with which people respond. They know that, but they know little else besides that. And somehow knowing that this invisible thing is harming you or influencing you doesn't make it any better. And you find yourself aware of just how much you don't know about this vast field before you. And social media is much the same way, right? Although Bluesky is not algorithmically driven, at least by default out of the box, it still works in mysterious ways. And meta platforms work in even more mysterious ways, right? We know that there's algorithmic manipulation happening behind the scenes, but we don't know exactly how it works. We don't know how it's coming out or manifesting to us. And that creates a sort of antagonism to the ignorance that one is experiencing, right? You know that you're being influenced, but you know that in order to really understand it, you have to become an expert. You have to get a PhD or a master's degree or become a highly specialized technical expert, perhaps. In the case of the examples that Beck mentioned, you'd have to be a nuclear scientist or a nuclear engineer or a certain kind of biologist or meteorologist in order to have a more comprehensive understanding of events, and most people simply do not. They are aware that our world is infinitely more complicated, but ignorant of how to really master that. And so that's what that subheading of the article means. And to get to how that makes sort of social media really bad for us, I am starting to think of it as a public health problem. Now, I also want to thank Samantha and shake my fist at her because in the editorial process, she very much urged me towards this conclusion. Like, I was talking with her about things that, like, oh, I kind of want to say this, but that would be too radical, right? And she's like, no, no, you should say that. That'll be a snappier conclusion. And so that led to me
And I
saying,
was right.
you were right. You are a very good editor.
Samantha plays this role at Liberal Currents frequently, including with this podcast, I would say.
She is a very good editrix. And it led me to speculate out loud, gun to my head, would you just ban social media with the wave of a magic wand? And I say yes. Now, that is speculative, and I'm not actually saying that that should be seriously pursued, especially not with the governments that are in power, where most social media companies are headquartered, right? But I think that over the long term, if we are to get out from the mess that we're in, we do have to start thinking about social media in the way that we think about pollution, radiation, and infectious disease, right? I'm very pro nuclear power, actually. I'm happy to let my radioactive symbol freak flag fly here. But I'm pro-nuclear power when it is very carefully regulated and subject to extremely strict safety restrictions for all the obvious reasons spelled out by our common history, right? And pollution is a byproduct of many necessary processes for building a complex society and economy, but it can be reduced and it can be regulated. Much the same with smoking or alcohol. Uh, Pleasurable activities that are nevertheless subject to asymmetric scrutiny, regulation, and taxation. And I think that it's not unreasonable to start conceiving of social media in much the same way.
Oh, I think that's a point that's well taken, whether you want to ban it or not. Like for example, you started off this talk by talking about how Blue Sky hopes that they're going to use, computer code, a technical solution to create a social effect. And oftentimes you'll see people coming out of Silicon Valley who basically seem to think that, modern technology, information technology, social media, etc., basically can't be regulated, right? That it's all about the code and not about the law. But I think if we do a little bit of, comparative analysis, we can see that this isn't true. Code isn't the law. The law is the law. So other countries do regulate their social media much more intensively than we do in America. Germany kind of famously, bans Holocaust denial. That is not protected under, as free speech in Germany. And as a consequence, if you're a Holocaust denier, you are not on the German internet. To take a more extreme example, China is very worried about the possibilities of social media for organizing opposition to the government. There's all kinds of incredible examples, like the A4 protests, in which people would take a blank sheet of A4 paper and hold it up and take a picture of themselves. And the government cracked down on that very hard. You were not allowed to take a picture of yourself with an A4 piece of paper because the blank paper symbolized all the things you weren't allowed to say, but everybody understood you were saying. And the government very effectively was like, no, we're not going to have any of that. And I'm not suggesting that we should go there, but I do think it's, I mean, given recent events, possibly time to start thinking more carefully about what kinds of media regulation in general we should have. Again, in this country, we used to have the fairness doctrine that regulated not the content of political speech exactly, but how it was presented. Namely, that you needed to give, a certain kind of balanced approach to it. We haven't had that for a long time, but it is possible to have different forms of social regulation of this technology.
Going back many centuries, like plenty of historians will point to the printing press and say this led to great upheavals, and certainly there's truth to that. The question would be, is this internet era, however many few decades we're into it, is this something we just have to go through? Or is it something that we should fight harder against, to keep safer from the start rather than simply resign ourselves to some of the negative aspects, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Catherine brought up this example, but it's worth dwelling on it a little bit. The example of President Yoon in South Korea, who, like she says, was at one point a relatively normal conservative, but he gets sucked into this kind of far-right YouTube spiral where, you watch a video on YouTube about one topic and YouTube is like, oh, thank you for watching that. Here's 6 more on similar topics. And this one, you click this one because they're like, that seems a little bit, that's really interesting. What a provocative little thumbnail it's got on it. And, you 20 hours later, 40 hours later, whatever it is, you have immersed yourself in an alternate information universe. In Yoon's case, he seems to have come to honestly believe that the South Korean opposition party were North Korean infiltrators, or not necessarily infiltrators themselves, but they had been suborned by the North Korean government and they were trying to overthrow democracy in South Korea. And so his only recourse was to create a false flag attack on South Korea by North Korea. So part of the scheme was to order special forces to attack an American military base in South Korea. And then they were going to leave some North Korean uniforms nearby to be like discovered afterwards. The level of like this is the kind of like this is like a thriller plot, right? This is something that you read in a bad military thriller, and I'm not even really scratching the surface. None of this stuff actually happened, right? He did not actually effectively secure control of the South Korean military to get them to do all the crazy stuff he wanted them to do, but that was certainly his intention. And as of the last I've seen earlier today, he's holed up in the presidential palace, or the presidential residence, I should say. He's blockaded himself in there and is refusing to be arrested according to a lawful arrest warrant. Again, I guess because he's watched too much YouTube and he thinks that these are North Korean agents coming to get him. So when you see like the level of damage that social media was able to do to a powerful individual and to a country as a whole, you can certainly see the argument for regulating it more than we do now.
Yeah, like the you could call it the miseducation of Yoon Suk-yeol is
Yeah.
a very, very frightening example of this. And it's not even the first time, right? This happened with Jair Bolsonaro, it's happened with Donald Trump, and it's frightening for a welter of reasons. Like you would imagine that the president of a country, a powerful economy, with access to classified intelligence briefings, the ability to just summon the highest experts in the land to be able to pick up the phone and talk to other world leaders, that they would be satisfied with what they can know. And yet the allure of conspiracism is so deep that even the leader of one of the world's largest economies feels that he is getting the truth from YouTube more than he is from his own intelligence services, his own chiefs of staff. And it's mind-boggling. Jason looks like he wants to say something.
Well, YouTube, as you click through a sequence of videos, you are doing your own research.
Hmm.
When the head of the CIA just comes and slaps a manila folder on your desk like Fox Mulder, you're not doing the work yourself. You're just believing what they tell you.
Hmm.
Right now, I'm obviously making a silly comment, but like, could that be what President Trump is feeling? He's doing his own research, like that they all talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to what you were saying earlier, Catherine, about the invisible mediation of algorithms, or not necessarily algorithms, but just the structures of social media, that what you're presented with are, ordinary people talking directly to you. TikTok is especially egregious in this case, right? Where there's so many of these videos of somebody, it's just some ordinary American. They're in their car talking to their phone, telling you the straight truth that you're not getting anywhere
Mm,
else. But then what
mm.
has connected you personally with that other person who knows where in their car is an algorithm that has decided, oh, this is the kind of content that is going to go viral that we're going to put in front of you. Right. And I think this parasocial aspect of social media is key to understanding why it's dangerous in a way, that it gives you the illusion of perfect authenticity and immediacy without necessarily actually providing.
Yeah, like famously slash infamously, the Biden-Harris 2020 team liked to say as a mantra, Twitter is not real life. And this made a lot of people on Twitter very upset and hurt. And the thing is that empirically it was wrong because what happens on Twitter is real and consequential. It's part of people's real lives. But the truth that they were getting at is the way that I would phrase it is, Twitter is not a scientific poll, right? And it's easy for a lot of people across the political spectrum. I see this from everybody, from, leftists of every ideological caste, uh, progressives, liberals, centrists, the whole right-wing spectrum, that they mistake or routinely mistake, even I fall into this trap sometimes, of seeing my feed as this is what the people think. This is what the people are talking about. This is what the masses think. And no, it's just a narrow slice of an unrepresentative slice of the population is what I'm actually looking at, right? And I see this sometimes with how some, for example, like liberals on Blue Sky will say, "Oh, the left is doing this, or the left is, says that and whatnot." What they really mean is this narrow slice of Blue Sky communists that they happen to see on their feeds because they follow people who follow them, mayhaps, or they're in the extended friend circles or networks, and that's information, yes, but it's not a scientific poll of what this, gestalt entity called the left thinks, and vice versa. So many. I do see a number of leftists on Blue Sky say, the liberals are evil because they think this and doing this and blah, blah, blah. And they're really talking about a couple of guys they've seen that have gone viral for saying something stupid. And that locks you into a very toxic and divisive series of thought patterns. It's sort of the inverse of what you were describing, Samantha, which was sort of positive, right? That you feel like you are among the people and that you have this extended network where you can talk to anyone and share memes and information with one another. What I call the beautiful serendipity of social media. And that is hard to replace. But the flip side of that is that it also comes with this distorting effect. When we think about how it is that powerful people have microwaved their brains, I point to people like J.K. Rowling, for instance, or Elon Musk himself. Why do they become so obsessed with being anti-trans? Like, why that specifically? And a lot of that has to do with who these people ended up following on Twitter and how that over time really narrowed the aperture through which they see and understand the world. They may have had latent, dormant prejudices, but there was actually a very interesting thread about this on Blue Sky recently from some extremism researchers arguing that, like, yes, Elon Musk is essentially Nazi adjacent right now, but to say that this is a mask off moment, that he's always been this way, is misleading, right? That he had been sort of maybe subtly conservative or reactionary in the past, but he's gotten much, much measurably worse over the last few years. And it coincides with, and I think The Economist even did an incredible chart tracking some of this, that his Twitter usage increased massively, especially at late night hours, right? This is a guy who is one of the most powerful people in the world, certainly the richest man in the world, and he's spending an enormous amount of time posting endlessly, right? And it, as I say, narrows the aperture through which he sees and understands the world, exposing him to these horrid feedback loops of the worst people in the world giving him approbation, but also telling him what the issues are. And it's how he went from, sort of backslapping Obama to now openly campaigning for Alternative for Deutschland in the pages of Die Welt am Sonntag, right? Which was a whole other kettle of fish.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, another one of these details that's lodged in my brain is that apparently Elon Musk was recently caught posting anonymously, or he thought he was anonymous, but he was not, in fact, anonymous, posting on 4chan complaining to the moderators that there were too many anti-Musk threads and that they should do something about it. And I think, this gets to the way you were talking about that the scale of social media can kind of hack the social processing of our brains, right? That if, I mean, as someone who's been on the medias for probably too long, I can attest if 50 people are yelling at you on the internet, it feels like the entire world is yelling at you, right? If and conversely, if 50 people on the internet are telling you that you're a genius, it feels like the whole world is cheering for you. And this is true. I mean, this speaks to something that's common to us as human beings. It isn't really mediated or affected that much by wealth, right? If Elon Musk, when 50 people are talking shit about him on 4chan, it still gets to him, right? It still really bothers him that there are 30 threads complaining about Elon Musk because it turns out he's human, even though he's a billionaire. So I think that really gets to your point about the way it creates epistemic distortions. It creates epistemic distortions in ordinary people, certainly, these epistemic distortions are far more consequential when they're induced in, world leaders like President Yoon or Shadow President Musk or whoever it happens to be.
Yes, exactly. This is why so many people have said about my book, and certainly even about this thesis I advance on liberal currents, that it's unrealistic, right? Nobody's going to log off and permanently. And I say, well, look, like I I drink alcohol, right? I'm not a teetotaler by any stretch of the imagination, and I do not advocate for prohibition. But I do believe that there's much to be said for sensible restrictions to be placed on consumption, on the manufacture and sale of alcohol, and so on. And I think that similarly, people can and should cultivate better practices with their social media use. But I also emphasize that I'm not telling the world to log off completely. It's not just that I'm saying people should just use social media a little less or a little more intentionally, but that the epistemic elite in particular are the ones that really need to log off the most as a basic matter of harm reduction. I think that a lot of violence has been done by too many journalists, for example, being too online and that then distorting their view of the world. I am a sincere believer in the argument that a significant percentage of the anti-trans elite backlash that we've seen, particularly in the UK, but also in the US, has been driven by all of these people, the sort of chattering classes who all talk to each other, also being on Twitter and then talking to each other about, oh, those mean trannies, they harassed me on twitter.com. They said such mean things to me. They spoonerized my name. Can you believe that? And, them all talking to each other about this endlessly, ratcheting each other up, sort of radicalizing each other, and then going right back to the scene of the crime, as it were, and then saying stupid things that get people mad at them. And then they immediately take to the Atlantic or the New York Times and are like, whatever happened to decency in our society where, the trannies can make, ligma jokes at me. What has the world come to? And I sincerely believe, as dumb as this sounds, these people spending far too much time on social media exposing themselves to other people whose behaviors are conditioned by spending far too much time on social media has jaundiced their view of a lot of minority groups who advocate for themselves through these platforms. And I want to be very clear about what I'm saying here. This is not a victim blaming thesis by any stretch of the imagination. It is arguing that these people have quite deliberately put themselves, the journalists and so forth, put themselves in a position where, as I say, they narrow the aperture of their worldview and they don't realize they're doing it. They're not practicing good information hygiene, and it distorts and allows them to misinterpret what they're experiencing to the point where it then influences their ideological approach to the world and how they then frame it to people who are not extremely online. Because whatever else may be said, the people who subscribe to The Guardian or The Atlantic or The New York Times in their masses are not too online, right? Like, I love the connections game at the New York Times, and if you play it and you look in the comments of it, there are these wonderful people who every single day put out very exquisitely written crossword style clues for it, or for spelling bee in particular, right? These people are, older people, they're retirees. I have a hard time believing that those New York Times power users are also on Twitter all day and night. But they're the ones who are then being preached to by the various and sundry columnists at the New York Times, by the Pamela Pauls of the world, for example, about why a billionaire with a castle is being so hard done because people have called her an awful name, a transphobe. What is the world coming to? Right. And that influences people. So this is why I'm very, very clear in both log off and in this article that it's a matter of priority for the epistemic elite to really think about the information and social media hygiene, and for them to log off, because that will at least, think of it like ring vaccination, right? That you're not getting the majority of the population, but you're getting the people who are most likely to end up being super spreaders because of the nature of their work, right? The theory behind ring vaccination is that you prioritize, for instance, healthcare workers because they're the most likely to immediately and repeatedly come into contact with the sick, um, or to vaccinate those who are most vulnerable to getting ill because of pre-existing conditions they have, etc. And that by doing so, you'll have an outsized effect on protecting the community even before you vaccinate the majority of the public. I think of this as like ring vaccinating social media users, as telling the Ezra Kleins of the world that they should log off as a matter of priority.
And to add to that, just to be extra clear, when we say log off from Twitter, we mean log off from X, we mean log off from social media. Please continue to read fine websites such as liberalcurrents.com and to listen to the Neon Liberalism podcast. Wouldn't you say that's good advice, Samantha?
I think that's great advice. You, who are an ordinary person listening to this podcast and definitely not a social media addict, you can trust us to perform proper
Absolutely.
information hygiene, and to, once again, try to have a clearer view of our world, and in this case, the way that new information technologies are shaping the flow of information and disinformation, and everything in between, in ways that are increasingly shaping our politics and politics abroad. So, once again, thank you so much, Catherine, for coming on the podcast, and I hope to see you all again next week.